Good morning, class.
Good morning.
All right. Mark chapter 8, which means we're halfway there. If my calculations are correct, 8 is half of 16, right? All right, so to get our minds ready for today's class, let's go to our video.
What happened?
IT.
You gonna always have that with you? You gonna bring that every week? I'll get every other week.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not kicking over.
All right. No video today. Joe's not here, and I don't know how to mess with it. So let's get right into our reading. All right, Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 10. In those days, when there were again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them will have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and he started giving them to his disciples to serve to them. And they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. All right.
So they didn't learn anything, did they?
The most amazing part of this story, I think, is people went 3 days without any food. Their spirits were being very well fed those 3 days. Just the word. It says that Jesus felt compassion for these people and wanted to feed their bodies after he fed their spirits. So here's the first question. What is the difference between the 5,000 in chapter 6 and the 4,000 here, chapter 8? Besides the number of people, there's specific difference.
Was the 5,000 that they all just gathered at once, and the 4,000 were already with them?
It's not what I'm looking for, but that's a good point, yeah.
'Cause that's what you just said. I was just
Yeah.
repeating.
The 5,000 were mostly Jewish people, and the 4,000 were mostly non-Jewish people. And why do you think it was important for Mark to include this story that he spoke to non-Jewish people in a setting like this?
Probably you just said it, that it was important to get to the non-Jewish people as well as the Jewish people, the believers.
Any guesses, David?
I was going to say what Kay essentially said.
Well, I had to do some research on this, but apparently Mark's primary audience was Romans. So this is an important story. You say, hey, Jesus is just not here for Jews. He's here for everybody. And I think it was the fact that Jesus showed compassion to these people as well as the Jewish people, I would think that had been very uplifting to the Roman audience that Mark was speaking to, but also to us today. Is there anything else from this story that points out, is in anybody's minds that want to talk about?
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Why didn't the disciples learn anything from the 5,000? Like seriously, like, well, there's
I
no
was
food
thinking the
here.
same
Like, how are we
thing.
gonna do this?
Never encountered this situation.
Yeah. This is completely different. Oh my goodness. We fed 5,000 people with, you know, how we can feed 4,000 people? It's a completely different number.
I guess one observation is Jesus feels compassion towards a group of people. Who does he use to meet their needs? Who does he involve in the process?
Disciples.
His disciples. Has that changed?
No.
Church?
No.
No.
That's a good point, David.
I don't know if it makes any purpose, but you know, you see 7 a lot. You know, it's symbolic of complete. And they had 7 loaves, which was enough.
Just so happened
Yeah.
to have 7 loaves.
Well, I don't know. It's like quoted.
Well, they don't count the few small fish, but they don't count that as much as the fact that they had 7 loaves of bread.
Is the word 7 actually capitalized in there? Does that mean anything?
It's not in my.
Not yours. Okay. Just saw it up there. Anyway, move on.
All right. All right. Well, then we'll move on to the next part here, verses 11 through 21. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And they had forgotten to take bread, and he did not have more than 1 loaf in the boat with him.
Should be enough.
And he was given orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact you've had no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up?" They said to him, 12. "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?"
Sounds like he's getting a little frustrated.
Whoops. I don't think.
So let's just go to the first 2 verses. Do the Pharisees remind you of anybody today? Like every non-believer. Always, I point this verse out. The why does this generation seek for a sign? That really spoke to me. It's like, why does every generation seek for a sign?
Yeah.
It's like, but then he was doing it right in front of them. Like they could see with their own eyes. The Pharisees, they saw with their own eyes. But they didn't want to accept the truth.
So what does he mean when he says, no sign will be given to this generation? Is he talking to the Pharisees themselves, like, we already showed you enough, like, I'm done with you guys, or what?
That's what I thought. I was thinking that he was just saying, I am here. I am doing this in front of you. And if you're not willing to see it, then you will, that's on you. I'm not doing anything extra. I'm not putting on a show here.
Okay.
Well, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees certainly would have had the education concerning the scriptures and the foretelling of Christ's coming. And in the presence of ongoing miracles, what are you, blind?
Yeah.
Yeah, and which was the point, because they were blind. They were blinded by their own self-righteousness and ambitions. And as a result, that's why, in my mind, Christ, there will not be a sign. How many signs do you need?
It kind of reminds me of the slaves that fled Egypt. There's a giant pillar of smoke, fire, coming from the heavens, and they're just like, this isn't enough.
Yeah.
Grumble, grumble, grumble. Yeah, Bart.
As far as miracles being performed, weren't they, the wizards and such did that at that time, right? I mean, who else did that? They did, Jesus, here he's coming and he's doing this, so are they comparing him to the wizards who were actually truthful? I mean, I can see where they would think that, you know, not ever seeing any real honest person performing these types of miracles.
Magicians, you know,
Yeah.
sleight of hand. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's always been con men, you know, people that, you know, it's easy to not, you know, be the fool somebody, I guess, in that sense. And but I would think seeing a con man or like magician back then doing that compared to, especially because I think when he performed these miracles, people were around the ones that he's healed for years, and then all of a sudden, like, you can't. That's a crazy amount of acting, you know, to have that drag on.
So I got a couple things on that. So there's various like powers in the spiritual realm that can be used for good. You know, there's the good part, which Jesus is doing, and then there's from the evil realm as well. But was there any cases, I don't think so, that the evil realm was able to actually heal sickness or raise the dead? And does that make this a different situation than the magicians? The other one too, and I was thinking about it when he was speaking, did the Pharisees, whether they knew what the scripture said, did they even really want the Messiah to come during their time? Or were they just happy having the authority and power on the...
They wanted to be the
religious side?
kings. They don't want no one coming in
They didn't,
stepping on their pride.
They're supposed to be there to, you know, instruct and make people aware for when the Messiah does show up, but when he shows up, they're kind of probably hoping it wasn't in their time, right?
But David, didn't the people that were well versed in the scripture, the Pharisees, wouldn't they have known that the Messiah was supposed to come around that time anyway?
You should have. Yeah.
Maybe like Brad said, power and authority, they didn't want to give that up.
Not
Human
many.
nature.
Not many people do.
Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He knew as much or more than anybody, and he didn't see it
Mhm.
until he struck him down on the road to Damascus. But there was one thing I read, it's just what the guy said. He says the Pharisees demanded a sign from heaven, not just a miracle, a sign directly from God, which was Jesus. But they wanted to see more than that, evidently.
It was never enough. But even if Jesus decided to do a little extra, would have it even mattered? I would think that would be one of the reasons why. Is like their hearts, they were hardened. They were made up. They were never going to believe that he was the Son of God.
He was a carpenter's son, not a king.
Yeah.
Well, it's just like all the different churches there are today. And they're all in their own little box. And based on what they grew up with and stuff, that's all they know, and they're afraid to know anymore, and that's their world. So
There's one thing that drives me crazy.
They don't. If they hear the word, well, it can't be this way because this isn't what I was talking to you. That's what we have.
And the thing that drives me crazy about all the division in the Christian church is the fact that the foundation of all Christian churches should be the Word of God, right? That's the one thing that should combine everything together, and there's still division. And it's like, well, that's not the way we want to teach it.
I'm kind of curious with what Terry was saying is, what were they actually looking for? What's the sign that they wanted to see? Like, did they want to see like a transfiguration moment? Well, this is my beloved son, right? Did they want to see something like that? Would that be considered a sign from heaven? Like actually hearing God's voice as opposed to Jesus' voice? I don't know.
It's hard to say. I don't think it would have been enough.
Yeah,
He could have been floating and like radiating hotter than the sun. It would have been enough.
That's just another parlor.
Yeah, another parlor trick.
I was watching Jimmy Swaggart not long ago, and it was like an open forum of about 5 or 6 preachers, and they started on the Church of Christ. And I don't back off all this, and they don't bother me. And they was talking about you can't be, you're not saved. Before. You're saved before baptism, then you're baptized. They went through that. And then they started on, we are the only ones, and I've heard that before too. And they never mentioned, when it talked about, they never mentioned any scripture about baptism at all, not one iota. Is what they went to in Romans 6 or 8 or something. With your mouth and confess it, things of that nature. It's I don't know. It's to me it's just it's a sad scenario.
I mean, Jesus even what did it say? He sighed in his spirit, just like, how aggravating is this?
Well, there's a lot of emotion. A lot of churches don't believe in baptism. Their loved ones passed on, and they can't. They think, well, they didn't get baptized. And that's a hard thing for them people to overcome.
Yeah, he said it's a great thing when you're baptized and someone come up speaking in tongues, things of that nature. Like I said, there's 6, 7 verses on baptism. It says what it is. But when you make up your mind on something, it's hard to change.
It is.
Like you said. I say this all the time. When Catholics say, we have you till you're 6 or 7, we got you. And that's usually the case.
Well, as we move on, we see the disciples got so hungry they forgot who they were with. They witnessed not one but 2 events where Jesus fed a combined 9,000-ish people with 5 loaves and 7 loaves of bread. So many times they witnessed these miracles but still forgot who'd been taking care of them the entire time. How hard is it for us to remember that God is always taking care of us, no matter what problems, issues that we've been having or had in our lives? Yes, Stephen? You don't want to.
How hard is it?
How hard is it?
That's a good
Oh,
rhetorical
it's
question.
easy to fall into that mindset.
It's a good
It's-
rhetorical question, it's just a thinker, like not really respond to.
Yeah. It's
That's
easy
true.
to feel like
It's
you're on. your own
obviously
when you're-
hard.
Hope you don't have to make us write a paper on this.
It's hard enough for me to write. I ain't gonna have you guys write. Other than, you know, your worksheets, if you want to do that. I always, it's easy for the earth to distract us. Yes, Terry?
He says that the leavened bread is a figurative description of self-reliance on both like the Pharisees and Herod. And he says, this is a warning towards even his disciples to follow him. That's what this guy said anyway.
Interesting. Yes, Steve?
Well, you said how hard is it for us to fall into that? If you look at the world situation today, how many of us or those out there say, well, God is in control and he's gonna handle this, and for a lot of people, that's hard to get that concept, that with everything you see going on, to remember that God is in control of this whole thing.
It just appears, Satan wants us to think there's nothing but chaos all around us, and we just have to trust that
believe.
God knows what he's doing, because we would have nothing here if God never gave us a place to live. We'd have nothing. And there's always going to be distractions. I mean, the stuff's going on today happened back then, and since the beginning of time. There's nothing, and there's nothing we can do other than just trust and obey and just pray, and just know that he is there. And yes, okay, that's very hard to do sometimes, because Satan wants to keep distracting us. It's like, oh, it's just nothing but depression, bad things out there, it's gonna bring you down. It's hard.
I have a question about what is, it's probably a really stupid one, but in verse 15 it says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. They're not talking like food, right? Like, is that symbolic of like the teachings of
I don't think it's
the religious
cannibalism.
leaders, or the teachings of
Yeah.
the Romans? Is that?
It's an interesting question, David.
It's the leaven of unbelief. And you can see Jesus kind of pointing that out when he's talking to his disciples after dealing with the Pharisees. And he says, do you not yet perceive or understand, just like the Pharisees? Are your hearts hardened, just like the Pharisees? We have eyes that don't see, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
That leavening of unbelief, if you've ever baked bread, you get a little leaven in that lump, and it permeates to every bit of that.
I have a gluten intolerance, so.
There's gluten-free stuff out there, brother. There's hope.
Yes,
I got a footnote in my ESV that talks about that, and it said that it was a figurative description of the self-centered self-reliance of both the Pharisees and Herod, and that Jesus was trying to warn his disciples against that attitude.
Thank you.
There you go, Brad. Alright. Mark 8:22-30. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, for I see them like trees, walking around." Then again he laid his hand on his eyes and looked intently and was restored, and he began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets." And he continued by questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. So, why do you think at this time Jesus still wanted to keep have the disciples to keep the fact that he is the Christ.
Wasn't time yet for him to be crucified.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. They needed more instruction before his death. They needed to be more ready spiritually for what was to come. Without more teaching, they only would have had half the picture before they would need to be on their own. Anybody have any other thoughts?
I do on this blind thing.
Oh yeah, they spit on his eyes?
Well, that it took him 2 tries. I always found that interesting. I don't know why. But you would think, you know, God created the eyes, he can sure fix them.
Maybe he wanted to drag it
Why,
out a little
why
bit.
did it take twice with the blind man? I don't have any insight, I'm just throwing it out there.
What do you think, David? What do you think could have
I don't
been
know.
2 tries?
I don't know.
But these are the things we should be looking at, David. Come on now.
Sorry.
I don't know.
You know, when I pray for people to be healed, I always look back at this and say, well, maybe there's good reason for us to not just say one prayer and just assume God's going to take care of it. I always kind of looked at it that way, like, okay, hey, this person's been sick. I need to pray all the time for them until they're better. Because sometimes it doesn't work on the first try. But again, I don't know how biblical that is, but that's what usually comes to my mind when I read the
What do you think, Barb?
it took twice.
You have to remember too, that they're still under the Old Testament law, and this is a transition time where Jesus is trying to make them see a better law's coming. And that's hard for people to understand, when they're still under the specific law that they have to keep.
Yes.
And
Terry?
Well, the guy that I read said this is very unique, like you said. Usually when he says it happens, or he does it happens. He does it like you said in 2 stages.
But it is interesting in the passage as you read through this that following the first attempt, the scripture does not say he opened his eyes. But further down, he says, then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly.
Yeah, first time he said it looked like trees walking or whatever.
So, is that the veil? I mean, is this symbolic of, all right, like everybody, are you blind? You know, you're walking around with your eyes veiled, you're not seeing what's going on in front of you. Again, I don't know, I'm just supposing. I think it's interesting that the first attempt, it does not say he opened his eyes.
He had to do that for a reason.
So, I don't know, it's
So
curious,
not-
something
not-
intentionally interesting.
Yeah. Not that he couldn't have done it on the first try.
There must have been a reason.
Yeah. So let's finish the chapter. 31 through 38. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." And he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Wow.
So kind of going off of, what we just finished with that last section, why can't they go and just tell everybody what's going on? And in this case, Peter took Jesus aside and was like, we got to do this. And obviously Jesus got mad or upset and said to set your mind on God's interest, not man's. So that kind of goes back that it wasn't yet time. Jesus had to fulfill a lot of prophecies. And maybe them going out and shouting wasn't, in God's timing for all that day.
How many times is Peter just not want to accept the fact that Jesus was going to have to die on that cross?
Because he liked him that much.
Yeah. It was hard. And he's telling him, it's going to happen. It's like, well, no, they're lying. God does not lie. So it's crazy. If I had to describe these verses with one word, that word would be acceptance, or at least lack of acceptance. Disciples needed to accept that Jesus was going to die on the cross. The disciples needed to accept that they were not going to be there to protect Jesus, not there to protect Jesus, but follow him. And Jesus made it clear we needed to accept that we had two choices in life. Accept Jesus and live our lives knowing he is with us, or reject Jesus and be rejected by the Lord. What we see what's going on in the world today, a bunch of sheep without a shepherd. Before we get ready for worship, does anybody have any final thoughts from this message or anything else we have covered today? David.
The famous verse, verse 36, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Or for his soul? We're willing to forfeit our souls for much less than the whole world. Like Jesus puts the extreme example. Everything in all creation can be yours, but it's not worth your soul. Meanwhile, we've got people who give up the most valuable thing that they possess for nothing. Something to think about.
It's true. Yes, sir?
He says, pick up your cross and follow me. So, I got an idea. I don't know if anybody else does. So what do you think that means?
I would think it would mean, obviously he's foreshadowing his death, and he's going to take that cross. It's like, if you're going to follow me, this is the life life that's going to happen. And also a lot of the disciples ended up dying after Jesus died too. They were murdered. And I would think this would be like, if you're going to follow me, this is going to happen in your life.
Yeah. He says, if anyone would come after me, that broadens the scope beyond just his 12, right? Mm-hmm. Any of us who say we want to follow after Jesus, these are the marching orders to take up a cross. What was the cross but an instrument of death? Mm-hmm. And an agonizing one. We have to die to ourselves daily. Jesus would say otherwise. Elsewhere, I think Paul says it too. We have to make the conscious decision every day to say, it's not about me. It's not about my wants. It's not about my desires. It's about following him and doing what he would do.
And if you look at the world today, they're trying to change the definition of what a good person is. And Christian does not fit the world's definition of a good person, because we are not accepting of what's out there, because we want to follow the word. I mean,
when I was thinking about, him having to keep telling them, they did follow him. They left their nets and their boats and everything and followed him without question. But if we don't question, if they didn't question, then there's no opportunity to teach. You know, if they didn't question him and just followed him blindly, then he would not have been fulfilling what he needed to fulfill by teaching them. So just like David or anybody else that speaks, if we don't question what they're teaching us, then we're following blindly. We have to question so we can learn.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because you have to question. The one thing I like, one thing that's great about what God done for us is the fact that we have free will, right?
Yep.
We have the free will to do that. If God was a dictator, would he want us to question? No. He wants us to question because he wants us to learn. That's a really good point. He wants us to learn. How can we learn if we think we know everything? Which one went first?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ted. Well, the only thing I was thinking, we all have different crosses to bear. So it's not the same for everybody. I mean, we have personal crosses, and we have to make a decision as to what we're gonna do with that, and how we're going to put that aside so that we're following Jesus.
To
Yes,
me, denying self is trying to follow what he says and not do what the world is doing. You have to stay, in my opinion, you have to try to stay in that realm of him.
Good point. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think putting it together is, like in what we were talking about earlier, he was warning the disciples, don't fall into the trap of Herod, don't fall into the trap of the Pharisees. And it speaks to us in the same way. Don't fall into the trap of what society is saying is acceptable or society is saying is right. Pay attention to what you've seen, pay attention to what you know, and follow me. So I think that's a message that we can take with us today is don't listen to the voices that are leavening the bread.
Yeah.
I had a school teacher say to me once, there are no dumb questions until I open my mouth.
That's a lie. I think it's important, especially when we're teaching, that we should have an open mind to people's questions and stuff, and not be so dismissive, because if they're willing to ask the question, that means there's a chance they're willing to learn. And I think it's an important thing to think about, because it's hard. You know, like what you guys said, how about in the church, you're brought up to think one certain thing, and when it's, you know, and you get a little older, it's kind of hard to get off that one certain thing, and it gets way harder when you get older. So hopefully we can run into people asking more questions, so we have the opportunity to teach them and they can learn and grow. Yeah, Terry?
One says, study to show thyself approved, the workman unto God, needed not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That's where it's at.
Good point. Well, thank you so much for your participation this morning. Next week, Mark chapter 9. Let's go worship.